Okay, everyone. So I think that the numbers have more or less settled now. I'm Jasmine. We just started this new political education Wednesday call. Um, this week we have on Brian Palmer with Tom Reid. That Tom is going to ask Brian some questions about his upcoming book, as well as just his other books as well, I imagine. And Brian's a historian, but I'll let Tom give him more of an introduction. I just wanted to go over some kind of administration things about the campaign. So next week at the same time, Eve is going to come on and talk about his case with his lawyers about the emails, the email case that he was just charged as guilty, and his sentencing is in March, which of course he's appealing for sending emails to the police. So definitely come for that. On Mondays, we have our general meeting for everyone who's been supporting the campaign so far. So we'll keep any questions tonight for Monday, or else you can email. I put my email into the chat. Um, Next month, we have the NDP convention, as many of you know. I hope that I'll see a lot of you there. And I'm going to be launching my campaign pretty soon for the NDP president. Um, so watch out for that. I'm hoping that you guys can support me in that, hand out some materials. It's just kind of an opportunity for us to continue talking about our policy book, as well as I get to make a 5-minute speech in front of everybody at the NDP convention. So it's a good opportunity to air out some grievances and put forward an alternative vision for Central NDP. So yeah, just last bit of housekeeping. We're going to take some questions at the end. Tom is going to ask Brian questions for maybe like 45 minutes or so. And then it'll be an opportunity for everybody else to ask questions. But we'll just ask you to keep your comments or questions quite brief. And we will be enforcing a time limit if it goes on for too long. So just be aware of that. It's not personal. And now I'll hand it over to you, Tom. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Jeff. The mass protest in Minneapolis last month that reached a day of action was quite significant and backed Trump off, created a lot of interest in the left in general. Um, this came as in a city which had quite a history in the left, and particularly what we're going to talk about tonight is a strike that took place in 1934. Um, After years of falling wages and rising unemployment, factories closing down, people being thrown out of work, people having trouble getting enough to eat and feed their children, um, the American workers tried many times, and there were some in Canada also strikes that failed and were unsuccessful. There were a lot of people around who were willing to take jobs and work for almost nothing. The bosses had all the power, and after a few years, in 1934, in the spring of 1934, there was a resurgence of the labor movement in the United States that had a major impact in Canada. Our working class benefited from it quite a bit. And what kicked it off were three almost simultaneous general strikes in three different American cities. One was in Toledo, one was in San Francisco, and one was in Minneapolis, what Brian's going to be talking about tonight. Um, what was interesting about these three general strikes is that they were not in any way coordinated. None of the people involved in them had been in touch with others to say, well, we'll all do it at the same time or anything like that. Um, in fact, they were all being run by three separate militant socialist revolutionary groups, which weren't particularly fond of each other at the time. Um, and The result was not only did they win immediate concessions in their particular areas, but it touched off the working class came to recognize that if we join together, if we struggle, we can win. We don't just always have to lose. And it created an enormous amount of momentum, and that momentum turned into the drive to industrialize, to unionize rather, the big industrial sectors of the American economy, created the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations. Millions of workers were were organized, millions of people's lives benefited very significantly. And as I said, the effect was felt north of the border as well. Um, the unions that were created as a result of this time extended into auto.
Sorry, Tom. I'm just going to jump in. Every time that your face lowers, the mic drops.
Okay, thank you. I'll try not to lower. And Brian. Okay, so in any case, this is a very significant event that Brian's talking about tonight, and it's I think it's not just of historical interest. There are a lot of lessons that we can learn and we can apply in the very near future, I hope. Um, Brian is, as many people know, perhaps everyone here knows, is Canada's probably foremost radical uh, historian of the radical left. And he's produced an enormous number of very valuable studies, in my humble opinion. This is the book that he published on it's called Revolutionary Teamsters. It was actually published in 2013. Well worth reading. And I think it's the definitive work on that subject. So, as Jasmine outlined, the format that we're talking about, uh, now let me see. I've lost the first page of my question. Bear with me. Okay. Um, so I've got some questions I'm going to put to Brian, and he will an answer. Um, One of the things that you point out in your book, Brian, is that in the early 1930s, Minneapolis was considered to be a right wing town. Unions were weak. The working class was um, not particularly influential, and there was a very well organized anti union movement of the local businessmen called the Citizens Alliance. What were the main factors that permitted the successful explosive struggle, given that kind of circumstance, that kind of background?
Uh, okay, thanks, Tom. And I hope people can hear me, and I'll let Jasmine cut in. Oh, good, thank you. I think there's two components to that question. The first component is is a structural one about the political economy of Minneapolis in that period. It was largely by the early 1930s, it was a political economy on the verge of transformation. An old sort of regime of accumulation had centered on forestry, wheat, minerals, and an old guard um, uh, of employers had established an anti-union presence, which was really very forceful. For much of the early 20th century, Minneapolis was known as an open shop town. There were no unions. The Labor Day parades were often quite sort of subdued, and it often featured a donkey with a scab kind of profile on it, saying, this is our town. Um, Radical unions like the IWW had largely been driven out by the 1920s, suppressed in sort of brutally so. There were stool pigeons in many of the established unions, and even the craft unions were not especially strong. The American Federation of Labor, mainstream business unions were not especially strong. So as Minneapolis entered the Great Depression in the early 1930s, the labor movement per se was weak. And the employers were strong. But turn that upside down, it meant that there was, for a radical contingent, a revolutionary contingent, small but forceful, that had been located in Minneapolis, it could play an even larger role than maybe it normally would have. And there was a group called in the 1930s called the CLA, the Communist League of America. This is a senile moment. Communist League of America, who were dissident communists. Many of them had actually gone back to radicalism of the even sort of pre-1910 years when they had been members of the industrial workers of the world. They were really no more than a dozen people, and probably 5 or 6 key people who were worked largely in the coal yards, driving coal trucks for delivery or shoveling coal into the trucks. And they were affiliated with the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, but had a very different organizational strategy. They knew that you had to organize all workers in an industry, and you had to have a very protracted sort of approach to class struggle politics. And they'd been active and talked about organizing a more militant union presence since the late 1920s. Then the Depression hit. It cut sort of the labor movement off, as weak as it was at the knees. And it took some time for them to actually mobilize. And by 1934, still in the midst of the Depression, but there were signs that workers were on the move. And even from the federal government, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1934 was the year that he issued a famous, piece of legislation that many workers interpreted as giving workers the green light to organize unions. It really wasn't that, because it was giving workers the green light to organize unions under the auspices of the state and within the kind of parameters that the state thought they should struggle. So by 1934, the members of the Communist League of America were poised to exercise an influence in a working class that was ready to move and that didn't have an alternative leadership in the more mainstream conservative trade unions.
Okay. One thing perhaps not widely appreciated now is that at that point, the main organizations of the unions were craft unions, the AFL. And the Teamsters was a craft union at that point, and that I think was a significant part of the strike. I believe in early 1934, the Teamsters Union in Minneapolis only had about 75 people. It grew considerably in the course of the struggle. Can you talk a little bit about the role of both the local leadership of the Teamsters in Minneapolis and the role of the national leadership of the Teamsters in relation to the initial organizing, the initial strike again in February 1934, I believe. A little bit about how that happened and how it unfolded and the role that those two levels of union leadership played.
Yeah. Well, the local leadership, which were gathered around the Communist League of America figures, but included people not in the Communist League of America who were farmer labor supporters. For instance, a guy named Bill Brown was actually the president of the General Drivers Union, or the IBT local at the time. And the CLA militants and revolutionaries, they had won these people over to see them as real leaders of class struggle politics. Dan Tobin, who was the leader of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, and we have trouble imagining the Teamsters as a craft union. We don't think of it that way now. But at that point in time, Tobin and the IBT international leadership were incredibly conservative and conceived of them organizing only drivers, no other workers associated with transportation in any other sphere. Warehouse workers, market and in Minneapolis would be a central sort of pivot of the strikes that happened in 34. The common term was chicken pluckers, people who and vegetable loaders,
not worthy of being in the union.
Dan Tobin, when John L. Lewis tried to push the organization of all industrial workers in the Congress of Industrial Organization, the CIO, Tobin was his most reactionary opponent and actually said, these people are rubbish at labor's door. We don't want them. And in fact, in all of the strikes that happened, and there were 3 of them in Minneapolis over the course of 1934, the CLA militant leadership of the Teamsters local had to battle not only employers, the state governor, the police, but their own union leadership at the international. It did everything to hold back mobilization of workers and organization of all workers in the trucking sector. So you really, they were fighting with one hand already tied behind their back by their own union leadership, but they were so effective, and we'll talk about this in various ways, that Tobin eventually was forced into a retreat from his more reactionary position.
Well, let's start with the February strike because that's the first one. I've lasted 3 days. Can you outline a little bit of
I'll just ask you to lean forward.
all right. Um, Bryan, can you the the origin of the strike was a 3 day strike in February, I believe. You talk a little bit about how that took place. I think it started just in one coal yard, or were there more?
No, there were more than one coal yard involved. But again, it was these CLA militants who were the leadership. They had an, they had actually been holding back workers in the yards who were fed up with employers, fed up with the depression, and who wanted to actually, and they had no union recognition, many of these workers, because as you said, the Teamsters local at the time, the IBT um, uh, local, it had, really 75, 100 people at the most. And there were hundreds of people working in these coal yards, hundreds. Uh, the CLA leadership had to hold them back from actually walking out because they knew you had to plan a strike. You had to prepare for it. And so they waited until February when the coal yards were needed, when the coal was needed to people to heat people's homes
When they're making their money.
when they're making their money and the meeting that actually agreed on the strike, hard to believe. I've seen a source that says there were only 34 actual Teamsters who voted to strike in February. Only 34. Hundreds would support them, but 34 people passed the motion to strike. They wanted to prepare the strike with Tobin's help, and he refused, and they went around him. They basically, did it on their own.
So, what kind of preparations did they take?
Well, they had a plan that they everybody who was at the driving trucks at these coal yards, the night before the strike, they parked their vehicles at the gates of the coal yards and took their keys home with them. So the gates were blockaded. Now, you have to understand that this strike took place when employers had no idea it was coming. They were that well and secretively organized. And that the employers were so confident and complacent because of their unbridled power and the fact that they had not been opposed. There hadn't been a strike in Minneapolis since 1918. And so they caught the employers off guard. And so the strike was a great victory, although as the CLA leadership, both nationally and in Minneapolis, would always stress, it was a limited victory. They didn't even achieve in the February strike union recognition. They got some better conditions and they got some better wages. But what they did was show the workers of Minneapolis and the workers in the coal yards and in the trucking sector that it was possible to fight back and win. And so they were happy to make a limited victory of some wages, some concessions. They caught the employers off guard and in a good, in an auspicious moment for them. And so it was in some senses they were counting on the fact that in proving to workers that this could be done, more could be done in the future.
And so the CLA cadres who were leading this, they didn't see this as a one and done. They saw this as an initiating struggle that could lead to more. And I believe that in by April or May, the numbers of Teamsters organized in Minneapolis became 3 or 5,000 or something union, and then their next step was to launch a more aggressive step in May, several months later.
Yes, exactly. And I mean the strike of February had been concentrated in the coal yards. The strikes that took place later would deal with 166 separate employers in the trucking sector. which is an amazing number. And how do you organize a strike that actually confronts 166 employers with almost untold numbers of entryways to the actual workplaces, et cetera. And so they needed time to build this, but over the course of that period from February into May, when employers were beginning, of course, to say, okay, wait a minute, we've got to nip this in the bud, stop this momentum. And they're starting to push, you know, fire union activists, move in aggressive ways to limit the aggressiveness of the workers in the trucking sector. And workers, of course, are wearing union buttons. Again, there's no union recognition that's being given to all these workers, but there's something like 5,000 workers who are wearing union buttons in the trucking sector throughout Minneapolis by the time that in mid-May another strike unfolds. And this is a strike that's waged more for union recognition and a whole series of demands. And by that point, with the numbers behind them rising, and with the support of the national leadership of the CLA as well as its local on the ground people, they make just
So the CLA sent in experienced people to help.
yes, they sent in people who could edit a newspaper that they started to put out
They put out a daily paper
they
during
put
that
out
strike.
put out a newspaper called The Organizer, which then became a daily, which reported to the workers, which was incredibly important. Reported to the workers what was actually going on because the established newspapers in Minneapolis were putting out the bosses and the police's and the governor's perspective. And this daily newspaper was of vital importance to sort of expose the lies, to keep people informed, and it became part of a kind of culture of resistance. It had kind of joking columns written by people, but it was an alternative. They were creating an alternative culture in the midst of struggle to what capitalism had on offer. They organized a militarily run huge strike headquarters that stretched an entire block, which contained a commissary for people to eat at, which included a makeshift hospital, which they brought in sympathetic nurses and doctors in case there was actual confrontations where people would be injured. They created a roving picket, flying pickets, which is incredibly important in a trucking sector, where they would say, okay, there's a scab truck delivering, produce at such and such a locale. A picket on a truck would go out. They'd intercept the scab truck. They'd try to convince the driver not to deliver the goods. If he offered resistance, they would manhandle him out of the truck. They followed a practice which they had initiated in the February strike of when they seized one of these scab trucks, they would take the coal and dump it in the street in working class neighborhoods so that people could just come and take it for free. But by the time of the May strike, coal was not so significant, and it was produce. They made an alliance with with farmers organizations to only deliver necessary foodstuffs to particular locales at particular times where people could go and know that this was not actually breaking the strike. It was really an incredibly well organized and disciplined. And by this point in time, the membership's approaching the 7,000, which it would peak at by the end of another strike later in the summer in July and August.
I believe there was also that was the leadership of the Congress of America helped produce a daily paper, which is pretty impressive. But they also set up a women's auxiliary that did a lot of the picketing, I think, and we participated in demonstrations and put pressure on politicians. Um, uh,
Yeah, the women's auxiliary was very important. These had the national leadership of the Communist League of America, which James Cannon was the head, had experienced women's auxiliaries in coal mining struggles in Illinois in the 1920s, and they learned from that, and they set up um, uh, a women's auxiliary in Minneapolis, which contained many of the wives of some of the CLA leaders and militants, but also many wives of even mainstream trade unionists were involved. And the Women's Auxiliary played a role in raising money and tag days, in marching on City Hall to make demands of City Hall, and in serving on picket lines. And they were, and of course they played a gender specific role in the commissary, where they served food to thousands of people and their families during the midst of the strike. So the Women's Auxiliary was vitally important, and as one of the figures who I think played a key role in suggesting that this happened, an immigrant worker and CLA member named Carl Skoglund. He came to the
He was an illegal immigrant, I think,
he
wasn't he?
well,
Unpapered.
hard to know what's legal and illegal. And when he came in 1910, but he'd been a militant in Sweden.
Yeah.
He'd been kicked out of a union for his struggles in a seafarers mutiny, I believe. And he came and worked like a lot of the Scandinavians in the lumber industry. Tree fell on his foot and he limped the rest of his life. But he then was a coal yard worker. But he had played a role in pushing the notion of the necessity of a women's auxiliary, because he had seen in his time many strikes defeated because women who were responsible for much of household domestic economy at the time would see strikes drag on and drag on, their children hungry, and they put pressure on male workers to go back to work. And he said we have to include the women in the struggles and make them part of the struggle, so that they understand what's at stake, and they are willing to support the struggle through thick and thin. And that's in fact what happened with the Women's Auxiliary. It played a decisive role in sustaining the strike and in keeping women very much to the forefront of the militancy of the period. There's a picture in my book which we won't show you because it doesn't come across that well, but you often see in the Minneapolis strike and in many strikes of this time period, you see pictures of burly workers battling each other with clubs in the streets. In one of the major battles took place in the May strike, or it might have been July. Yeah, in the July strike. Sorry. There are two women actually going at it with clubs. One, a woman associated with the Citizens Alliance, and another, a woman associated with the local drivers union. They were there on the picket lines, and in fact, they were often in some uh, skirmishes got brutally beaten, which again angered, understandably, the male strikers even more.
I think just related to that, a sensible precaution that they had at the union headquarters was they had armed guards, I think. Is that they
They
set up a machine gun at one point on the roof, as I recall.
I'm not sure it was a machine gun, but they certainly had armed sentries
Okay.
on the roof of the strike headquarters. And if they did have a machine gun, it was certainly never fired.
Right.
But and who knows whether it actually could fire? I mean, where they would have gotten a machine gun at that time, I've often wondered. But they did have armed sentries, and again, it was just I mean, when you see the pictures of this strike headquarters and listen to people in oral testimonies from the 30s remembering what it was like, it was an amazing accomplishment what they did with these headquarters.
One other thing which I think is worth mentioning probably is the organization of the strike was a strike committee, a committee of 100, I think, that gave it some flexibility, I think, and was significant at different points.
Yeah, they
But
had,
broadly based.
they had an executive kind of leadership, but they had a strike committee of 100 that would be called to actually decide on any new abrupt new tactical issues, or even debate long-term strategy. And that committee of 100, of course, contained all the people who were, affiliated with the Communist League of America, but it contained, again, many, many others, people who would have been Farmer Labor Party supporters, people who might have even been members of other parties that might have even been quite conservative. It drew in the entirety of the working class.
In the strike, as you mentioned, the marketplace was a sort of critical, was a strategic area, and that was a center for the struggle that erupted in the May strike, as I understand it.
Yes, the the May strike lasted longer, and it was a more, as I said, more protracted struggle, but also a more focused struggle on actually winning certain union recognitions and collective bargaining rights, which had all been sort of put on the back burner somewhat during the February strike. To just uh, the market became a pivotal place because it was a place where um, deliveries would be made, and the police and the employers um, would actually try to truck in even, I mean, insignificant amounts of goods, but simply to symbolically break the picket line and break the resolve and the morale of the strikers. And they also did a series of very clandestine and underhanded things. I mean, the ways in which the employers and the police, functioned in tandem and were willing to actually physically harm and even kill strikers was uh, phenomenal at this point. And one of the key events of the May strike, which really angered strikers, was called the Tribunale ambush. And what the Tribunale was a place where trucks would go in the morning to pick up newspapers to be delivered around the city. And of course, the strikers were not having any part of that. And the strike headquarters had actually been infiltrated by a provocateur that the cops placed in there, and he managed to get the dispatcher. He managed to get hold of the dispatcher's microphone, and he said, "Okay, we have an event going on at the Tribunale, and we need a truck down there." And he actually said, "And some of you women here, we probably need you there too. You jump on the truck as well." And they sent the truck was then sent into an ambush where basically the cops were waiting for them and beat them mercilessly, including the women, all of whom came back to the commissary to be patched up and or the makeshift hospital. Um, and that then precipitated what's called the Battle of Deputies Run. Um, the Citizens Alliance, its supporters, a motley crew of kind of fraternity boys, local bourgeois elements, and a few gangster types and lumpenish types, were sort of very much committed to breaking the strike and thought again, given the complacency of kind of the ruling class's ideas, they thought again that they could just take these strikers in the marketplace and kind of just basically defeat them militarily. Some of these bourgeois types showed up in the marketplace, which had cobblestone streets, wearing polo hats and mountain climbing boots with cleats in them. Not really good for running on cobblestones. Um, at the Battle of Deputies Run, which came a couple of days after the Tribunale massacre, the union, the local drivers union, and the CLA militants organized a massive kind of confrontation.
There were something like Citizens Alliance. Yeah, right wingers.
Yeah, but there were thousands of workers. They descended on the market, and the police were there in force, but they soon realized that they were no match for the workers, who came prepared with hats stuffed with padding so they could take a beating on the head, with various makeshift weapons, including like sand-filled and blackjack things. And in that melee, it didn't last long, but the workers workers routed the Citizens Alliance supporters
And the cops.
and the cops. The cops retreated almost immediately, knowing that they were kind of both outmanned and outgunned, so to speak. And two of the Citizens Alliance supporters, including a kind of fairly high up bourgeois figure, were actually uh, killed in the struggle. Um, now, and local media was there and forced to witness it. And not only that, um, the movie theaters of the time had sent in newsreel
Okay.
cameramen. You know, in the
Right.
30s, they used to show these shorts before movies would come.
Before TV news.
Before, yes, and Cannon, the CLA leader, wrote about how you know wonderful working class audiences were when they saw um, the newsreel shorts of this battle of Deputies Run, and they saw workers fighting back and winning. Because he said normally what you see is workers getting defeated and demoralized and beaten down by massive forces of cops, National Guardsmen, employer thugs, etc. This was a fight in which the workers won, and so there'd be cheering audiences in working class theaters across the United States when they saw this different outcome in Minneapolis.
One interesting detail I thought was I believe that the one concern they had was going in to confront all these scabs and Citizens Alliance. The police were there in some numbers, 100 or a couple hundred maybe. The police being armed, they had to worry about getting shot. And the tactic, as I understand it, that the union came up with was to drive a truck into the middle of the police and scatter them so that they were reluctant to pull their guns out because at that point, people were all over the place and they might shoot. Um, is that
Yeah, they
what
they
happened?
they had a truck, and as soon as the police put kind of made their appearance, they did drive the truck into the police, and the police scattered. Um, and I think that the police had not really fired on workers in Minneapolis up to that point. Um, they would later in the summer strike in July and August. But they the workers were willing to confront them, were willing to fight, and they didn't expect the police to shoot at them, really. Um, and that would prove to be a fatal error in July and August. But they were successful in the May strike in keeping the police somewhat at bay. And in fact, after this melee in the market in the May strike, um, the union workers and their leaderships controlled the streets and were controlling traffic and were functioning as kind of on the beat cops in terms
I
of.
think the day after the Battle of Deputies Run, wasn't there a rally of something like 20,000 workers came out to the market to support the union?
Yes, there were huge rallies all the time, and some on the knoll, which is like a big park. Some there were nightly meetings outside the large strike headquarters, and there were mass pickets at the market as well.
Can you say a little bit about how the state authorities and the municipal government at both levels, what their response was?
Well, the police were vehemently opposed and, of course, dedicated, according to them, to preserving law and order. They grew, especially after these May confrontations, they grew especially violent. And the police chief ordered lots of new weapons in. Um, they they began to attack the communist leadership of the strike. They began to issue kind of you know false statements that communists and gangsters were being brought in by the union from Chicago to fight on the streets. They arrested two of the leading CLA figures, James Cannon and Max Shackman, who were key figures in editing and writing for the organizer. They threw them in jail. And the governor of the time, Lloyd Olson, was a lead, was a member of the Farmer Labor Party, who was straddling the fence of how to actually function in the midst of this strike. I mean, he would eventually call out the National Guard, take over the union headquarters and throw a lot of the union leaders in jail. But he also had to appeal to his working class constituency. And the CLA knew that rather than uh, you know, simply denouncing and attacking him, they would pressure him to function as his rhetoric suggested he should. So they were able to get some concessions from him at some times, but at all times, sort of keeping workers abreast of the fact that he could not be trusted. He would function in the end in the interests of the employers, and they had to be wary of. And of course, many of these workers were farmer labor supporters. So it was a kind of constant battle there. Um, and uh, meanwhile, the employers are digging in their heels. They're
But the strike ended, I think, a couple of weeks after it started with a victory. They did have to recognize the union, or they did recognize the union.
they recognized the union, and it was a victory. But again, as Cannon and others would constantly stress, it was a limited victory, and the limitation was that it was never really ascertained decisively what the membership of the union that was being recognized was.
Who they were.
The inside workers, for instance, who was and was not a member of the general drivers local. And this was an area where, you know, uh, some of the local leadership uh, probably fell down a bit in the sense that they trusted Olson,
The governor.
the governor, the farmer labor governor, who said that inside workers, yeah, that constitutes anyone that you people really want to organize. The employers never agreed to that, and Olson, of course, was being slippery. And the agreement that came out of the May strike was that any issues of disagreement between the employers and the union over who is technically in the union and who's not um, would be decided by arbitration. And Farrell Dobbs agreed to this and signed off on it. He was a leader of the strike. He had been won to the CLA and became a member in the midst of the strike. And Cannon pointed out that this was an error.
Yeah.
This was a mistake. And in fact, it very quickly became evident that it was a mistake because almost immediately after the signing of this agreement and the ending of the cessation of the struggle in May, the employers began to, of course, fire workers who they claimed were not members of the union and therefore were not protected by any kind of collective bargaining agreement. When these were actually Farrell Dobbs himself was fired because
they would be firing the militants.
they're picking them off and they're knowing what they're
So
doing.
this then, after a few weeks later, this led 6 weeks later, maybe in July, to the third strike.
That's right. There's a strike that starts in July and stretches into early August, I believe. And again, it is largely around this question of, who's in the union and who's not. And they go out again. It's quite incredible when you think of it. I mean, we think of class struggle today. Can you imagine any union, right now fighting three strikes in the midst of 1 year? And strikes that are, so illegal, and they're basically dividing Minneapolis. The entire city is polarized around this question of, are you pro worker and for the union, or are you with the employers and the Citizens Alliance? It was the class divide had never been, as dramatically clear, perhaps, in any other city in the country.
There's a book on that called American City. It was written in the 30s, I think.
A guy named Walker wrote a book called American City, and that's really his point.
Yeah.
It is a divided city, and it's divided at every level. The housewives are putting strike flyers in the empty milk bottles so that the milk delivery guy, you know, gets the union propaganda when he comes to pick up the empty bottles.
Now, one thing that you um, is much more vicious, and there were incidents. There was one major incident, I think, Bloody Sunday, where they actually fired on and killed several workers, and that led to a massive response by the working class.
Yeah, yeah. This was there again. It was a situation in which, and you got to understand that the police had not actually drawn weapons and fired on pickets so far, and in some senses, the workers were not ready for this. And there was another battle in the market, which was set up by the cops. Um, Basically, they were running once again a symbolic, you know, scab truck through the picket lines. The workers knew this was going to happen, and they sent workers in trucks. And as soon as the trucks came around the bend and drove into the market, one truck in particular, the cops were ready for them. They were shooting at them from, windows of 2 and 3 stories up.
Yeah.
They were shooting at them from the streets. The workers had no guns. They had never fired a shot at anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And the reporting was that they were shooting to kill. And there were two of the strikers who were killed and died as a consequence of their injuries, and many, many more.
Does it 60? I think
Lots of them. I can't remember the exact number, but there were many, many more. Impossible to know exactly how many, because many of them wouldn't have gone to hospitals, figuring they would be arrested, which was happening. But I mean, one of the guys, Harry de Boer, who later became a figure in the Communist League of America, the later Trotskyist movement, he first read Marx's Das Kapital in the Minneapolis hospital, where he was recovering from his leg, which he almost lost the leg. His injuries were so bad. It was a vicious assault, and Henry Ness was one of the workers who was killed at the market. They still have a plaque in the market where Henry Ness died. And they celebrate in Minneapolis every summer.
Who celebrates?
There's a Minneapolis strike remembrance committee that has a celebration.
Okay.
Now on the decadal anniversaries, there was a very big one in 2013, which I went and gave some talks at. But every summer they commemorated.
I think there were
the funeral
that's
procession was something like 40,000 people massed on the street to watch. They had hired an airplane, actually, again,
the
Union to fly over with a sort of remembrance of Ness. And that's Bloody Sunday is a moment, as I said, that's still remembered in Minneapolis.
So that ratcheted the struggle up quite a bit, and the governor sent in the National Guard at that point, and to try to put a lid on things.
The governor sent in the National Guard, but then again, the union and its militant leadership pressed him, and he had to sort of backtrack and also send the National Guard in to seize documents from the Citizens Alliance offices as well. But he was shutting down the strike when he sent in the National Guard.
And the National Guard occupied the strike headquarters and took the strike leadership to the stockade.
Those that they could find.
Right.
A number of them they couldn't find. And who communicated with him via other people delivering messages. Eventually, the strike leadership that was not incarcerated in the stockade pressured and convinced Olson that he had to release those strike leaders.
Did they?
Yes. Yeah.
But did they not organize a march for like 20,000?
Oh, there were marches. Every day there were marches and more confrontations. They did not give up the battle for the streets in the midst of and they arrested one leader, but another leader popped up. They had
a committee of 100.
They had that kind of capacity. You couldn't you can't jail the strike in the midst of it when you have a leadership and an organization which of the kind that they had.
So how was the strike finally settled?
Well, the strike was finally settled because it kept going on and on. And in fact, there were some in the leadership that actually wanted to throw in the towel as August, you know, kind of unraveled. And the militant CLA leadership just refused that absolutely. Um, and Cannon, who had come in from New York and was in there almost in Minneapolis almost constantly, said, "Well, if the local leadership thinks they can still win this, then we're going to fight it to the end." Um, Roosevelt started to put pressure on the local uh, Republican establishment and the business class in Minneapolis to actually settle this because it was, he worried for his reelection.
Mm.
And he was sending in mediators from the National Labor Relations Board, which Cannon and company said we went through three of them. They kind of just, they were not, these guys would come in and they wanted to control things. And they would go to the workers and to the union and say, I can be your representative and I will get you a deal with the employers because I can talk to them. And they just said, well, you can go and take them our message and what we want, but said you're not speaking for us. You're speaking as we want, as we want you to speak, and we'll make the final decision. In the end, I think a combination of the the fact that this struggle had gone on and on and on. There had been deaths, somewhat akin to Minneapolis in 2026. Um, you know, the ruling order was going to hang on as long as it could. Olson, a farmer labor governor, was in a particularly difficult spot. Um, and the pressure and the organization and the resilience and the willingness to take the fight to the opposing class interests that never wavered meant that finally, and it came almost as a surprise, there was another settlement and there was an agreement that the union had told told one of these mediators, this is the kind of thing we'll accept. And it was basically that there'd be free elections in every one of the trucking employers. And if a few of they decided that if a few of these employers, which had, fairly small numbers of employees, decided that they did not want to align with the union, then they could not be part of the union, but they would win them over later, mm-hmm. which they largely did. And so the large trucking employers overwhelmingly voted, all of them voted to be unionized. So, and again, the issue of who's in the union was resolved. The inside workers, the market workers, the chicken pluckers, the vegetable packers, these were all part now of the General Drivers Union, which by the end of the strike of in August had something like 7,000 members that were recognized members of the union. So the union went from, less than 100 people to 7,000, which is, quite a phenomenal story in less than 7-8 months.
And it's my understanding that there was a surge of unionization across Minneapolis outside of the truck driving industry. A lot of other workers got organized, largely as a result of this success.
Yeah, I mean, there had been unions there before, but as I said at the beginning, they were fairly weak. They were largely American Federation of Labor craft unions, an aristocracy of labor, if you will, that had that, sort of backward ideas. And really, a more industrial unionizing model took hold. Minneapolis became known as a union town, mm-hmm. a town that had been open shop, known for its scabs, known for its stool pigeons, known for the power of the Citizens Alliance. The power had shifted to some extent to, unionized workers and trust in an actual communist leadership by workers who were not necessarily communists, but saw that the union that had led them had been led by revolutionaries who weren't trying to make a revolution. They never said that. The
Mhm.
bosses said they were trying to make a revolution. They played that up incessantly, but the workers knew it wasn't true. They were fighting and willing to make settlements that were limited, but that advanced significantly the interests and the cause of the working class. And to this day, uh, the you know people like Vincent Ray Dunn, who was one of the leaders of the strike. There were three brothers, the Dunn brothers, who were pivotal. I mean, Dunn is remembered in Minneapolis with reverence. You know,
Just maybe as a final question, something kind of interesting, I think, and relevant today again is a few years after the strike, after the Teamster victory in 1938, I think it was, there was an attempt by the Silver Shirts, which was a contemporary fascist organization, to set up in Minneapolis, and they were boasting about how they would run the communist unions out of town, etc. The union had an interesting and led by Ray Rainbolt, I think. Um,
yeah, Ray Rainbolt was a an indigenous militant and member for a time of the Trotskyist movement in Minneapolis. And he was a leader of a workers' defense guard that was set up to basically, thwart fascist incursions into Minneapolis. And they would gather with rifles and practice shoot on, out in the outskirts of
in
Minneapolis.
your book, you said it became 600 strong. It was open to all unions, not just
Yeah, it
Teamsters.
it was open to all unionists, and there were certainly the core of it would have been probably members of the General Drivers Union, but any unionist who wanted to be a part of this was a part of it. That's enough. We never talked about, for instance, the unemployed. They, which is an expression of the inclusiveness of this. The federal mediators and government officials who went into Minneapolis were astounded that the unemployed were marching in the streets for the rights of these employed Teamsters and supported their strike. One guy wrote back to, Roosevelt and said, this is weird. These guys should be battling to get their jobs, but they're not. And it's because the union organized, like they organized the Women's Auxiliary, they organized a Minneapolis Central Council of All Workers, which included unemployed. And they had great success in integrating them in. And the organizer, their newspaper, would appeal to and address the needs of the unemployed. Later in the decade, not only were they fostering you know other union organizing efforts, but they were fostering the rights of workers on relief as well. They were leading relief workers strikes in 1938, 39. These same militants in the General Drivers Union. So there was and this organization of this Workers Defense Guard uh, really played a vital role in beating back the the attempt of the silver shirts and fascists to basically uh, drive out this communist-led labor movement from Minneapolis. It would
Instead, the fascists were driven out.
Yes, the fascists were driven out, but there's a downside to it, which is that the organization of that Workers Defense Guard would later be used by the state to argue that these workers in Minneapolis formed a threat to the World War II effort. And the leadership of the Minneapolis Drivers Union and Cannon and others in the leadership of what would later become the Socialist Workers Party were put on trial under the Smith Act for treason
In 1941.
in 1941, and with the explicit compliance of Dan Tobin,
Mm-hmm.
who finally got his chance
Mm-hmm.
to kind of beat back, uh, but not before people like Jimmy Hoffa said, "I learned everything I know about over the road trucking and organizing workers in the over the road trucking industry from Farrell Dobbs,
From the CLA.
from the CLA leadership."
Okay, I think maybe that's a good place to leave it, and we'll turn it over to Jasmine for
Yeah.
Q&A.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So interesting. Um, I guess, yeah, now if people wanted to raise their hands and ask Bryan any questions, I saw a few questions in the chat as well, so I can field those if we don't get any hands right away. I'll just ask people to keep their questions kind of brief. Um, yep, David, if you wanted to ask your question.
Yeah, yeah, thank you, Jasmine. Uh, Hi, Tom. Hi, Bryan. My question is uh, to Bryan, please. Would you explain the importance of grassroots rank and file discussion and decision making in organizing and mobilizing democratic unions and socialist parties?
Well, I think that what the Minneapolis events show is that there's a kind of dialectic, if you will, a leadership that is dedicated to class struggle politics and militancy and to democratic procedures can provide a forum for sort of an expansive working class militancy to develop. The general strike headquarters that I mentioned was during the midst of these strikes, particularly in May and in June and July, was an open forum for workers' discussions every evening. The hall would often be filled, and they had loudspeakers that would, translate the discussions inside the hall to those, sitting on the grass outside or walking the sidewalks outside. The citizens, pardon me, the Committee of 100 was a way in which the democracy could be translated into in a very sort of turbulent moment of class struggle, where you can't be having like a vote of everybody on every issue, but you can with a committee of that size and breadth and inclusiveness, you can actually have decisions being made that reflect the views of a broad spectrum of working class people. So I think it's very important, but I don't think you get actually the realization of democracy without a leadership that's actually committed to it and that's willing to embrace it, but also and push it in particular directions. Um, if you compare the leadership of the Minneapolis strikes and the leadership of the General Drivers Union to the leadership of the American Federation of Labor Unions, for instance, there's absolutely no comparison in terms of democracy and workers' involvement in their own struggles. Um, so I think it's and that reflects very much, I think, a lesson for today, because the struggle will have to be in unions in our time to create, caucuses and militant caucuses of workers that actually will push a labor officialdom towards democratic procedures and towards militant stands, because so much of the labor movement has lost that, basic um, orientation, of which the slogan, an injury to one is an injury to all, is a democratic slogan and an expression of a democratic practice.
Yeah, thank you. Ted, if you wanted to ask your question.
Sure. Thanks very much for this fantastic presentation to like the Eve Engler campaign and the two speakers. I love the interview style. And I wrote my question in the chat. I'm not sure if you're able to see it. So I'm better a writer than I am a questioner, but I'll just provide the context. I'm asking about the Catholic workers movement and also about small family farms.
There it is.
And
Yeah.
the purpose of my question revolves around our current situation of building coalitions with possible unlikely partners. Like for me as a Christian, I'm trying to work out how I approach socialism, even though I don't support Marx's condemnation of all religion. And so possibly currently, I'll try to make this shorter, but currently there might be, churches who are horrified by the situation in Palestine, but are still influenced by Cold War propaganda that, causes them to be afraid of communism. So yeah, I just wanted to, if you had any comments about the Catholic Workers Movement, who I understand provided hospitality and to the workers who were striking, and then also about the family farms who were being displaced by industrialization.
Well, on the Catholic workers movement, I'll have to profess ignorance. I just don't know that they played any role in Minneapolis. They could have, but I didn't come across in my research any reference to it. Um, of course, many of the leaders of the Communist League of America were, you would have to describe them as lapsed Catholics. I mean, they had been brought up Catholic. A guy like James Cannon was an altar boy. Um, but they had largely broken from the church when they embraced Marxism. Um, the churches did factor into the struggle. There was one instance where a resistance group of workers that was quite small was invited into a church to voice their grievances against the strike. Um, but the leadership of the strike attended the meeting and basically took it over and turned it around. So they were willing to go into the churches and put forward their views. Um, I'm sure there were uh, churches in working class neighborhoods that were aligned with the strikers and the struggles, but my reading of the literature on the strike and the research, the original research I did, didn't show a lot of that. So um, it could be there. And the Catholic workers movement played a progressive role in various struggles. I know more about them, you know, really from the 50s and 60s on. I'm not even I don't really know when they began to be an influence. In terms of farmers, the farmers were, small farmers were organized in their own union, which is called the Farmers Holiday Association, I believe, Farm Holiday Association, which was, obviously against agribusiness and against large capital and more. And they're the group that the drivers union made an alliance with about how, when, and where produce could be brought into the city, and that farmers group supported the strike very very strongly and unequivocally. And it showed again the far-seeing nature of the leadership, that they, instead of saying, well, we're just going to have a strike and we're going to block everything coming in, they organized ways in which necessities would get to people.
Mm.
It was a situation in which a kind of dual power was necessary. I mean, capitalism normally controls these things, but in the midst of this strike of these dimensions and proportions, the union leadership understood we have to make sure that people get the necessities that they get, and they were not in any battle against the farmers and the Farm Holiday Association. And typically farmers might have a view against strikes like this, but they won these farmers over, and I think that was again a part of their sort of vision of how you conduct a strike that's going to win, and how you win people over who, on the face of it, might not actually be supporters. And of course, many of these workers in a city like Minneapolis and a state like Minnesota had come off of farms. Many of the wives of workers would have come off of farms. So there's connections there on all kinds of levels. I would say more research probably has to be done on this. It'd be an interesting topic, but I'm begging off saying a lot because I just don't know.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's
Douglas?
great. I just wanted to emphasize how important I think it is to build coalitions with possible unlikely partners. That's
Yeah.
really why I brought this up. And thank you very much for your question, Pass. or for your answer. Yeah.
Thank you. Douglas?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Hi. So thank you, Tom, and thank you for these presentations here. Um, I come from a different tradition, and it's actually about multi-stakeholder ownership. And so putting our efforts into ownership rather than adversarial unions, right? So unions often maintain the oligarchs in power, that trickle capital and money come down from. And so the participatory approach, and how does that fit into your studies? And particularly looking at the collective domestic economy, industrial economy, and commercial economy together.
Huh. Um, well, that's a large question. Um, but I suppose the question I would have back to you, which comes out of the kind of historical struggles I've studied and written about, is, I mean, how do you get to this? What did you call it? Joint ownership?
Yeah, or multi-stakeholder ownership.
Yeah. How do you get to that given capital's power and authority, and given its and particularly in our times, it's almost rapacious insistence that, you know, of which we see Trump as a kind of, in some senses, an extreme articulation of the willingness to amass wealth on the level it's being amassed in our time, in, concentrating it in fewer and fewer hands. I mean, this was really what the Occupy movement was really all about. It went up with a bit of a bang and came down with a whimper, but nonetheless, they raised the question of, a very small proportion of the population amasses wealth and ownership of the means of production. And I mean, I think the what the Minneapolis strikers would have said is, we are striking for union recognition. We are striking for collective bargaining rights. We are striking for improving the lot of the working class in the here and now. As revolutionaries, they would have said, we want the collective ownership of the means of production, and we want the working class to be in a position to take that over. But to get there, we have to build struggles that actually convince working people that they can fight and win, and that they have the capacity to organize production. I mean, that was, in some senses, particularly, you see it in the strikes in the coal yards. I mean, they knew how to organize production, or they wouldn't have been able to know how to stop the sort of productive wheels turning. So I think that my response would be partly out of my own inclinations, but partly out of the working class struggles I've studied, is that I think participatory democracy will come through the expropriation of the bourgeoisie, not through any kind of participation with it. But that requires a protracted view of how you get there and what you have to do to be able to sort of win that possibility.
I guess it's actually a totally different field. But what our indigenous ancestors and the First Nations here were organized primarily around the domestic economy. So that flew by you, I know. And the way they organized is that all our ancestors in Celtic, Slavic, Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, everywhere, organized in 100-person multi-homes. It turns out today that 70% of people live in apartments, townhouses, and village areas where the average size is 32 units or 100 people. And so rather than confronting the industrial economies or commercial economies, we have the whole domestic economy the collective domestic economy that we can organize, and we can become strong, strong enough to take on the industrial and commercial through our domestic unity. So that it's another subject. It's kind of, none of you guys have looked at it, I know, but it's really an amazing, when we look at our indigenous ancestry, it's a huge opportunity to actually make a difference.
Thank you. If nobody has a question, I might ask one, Brian.
Sure.
Um, so I think if I understand correctly, like you're saying that one lesson that we can take from this is like a militant union leaders. Um, I guess like why do we not have such militant union leaders today? Because like I know even in Montreal, we had a metro strike a few months ago. It's such a difference from the strike that you outlined because they actually kept the service going at peak hours from like 7 till 10 a.m. and then 12 till 2 and then 3 till 5. Meanwhile, you're saying for the coal strike that like they planned it for February because it's the coldest month. So it's just like the exact opposite strategy. So like why do we not have that same like militant, I don't know, like perspective anymore, strategy?
Well, that's a big question, and it's a good question. Um, and I think what we have to understand is that capitalism as a system of accumulation has a long history, and in some senses, a very effective history of incorporating mobilizations of resistance. And it has had a very effective recent history. By recent history, I mean since basically World War II, of incorporating, for instance, the labor movement. Um, and much of the labor leadership is wedded to the notion of what historians call the post-World War II settlement, right, where collective bargaining was actually won in a broad way for the working class for the first time after almost a century of struggle. But along with that um, recognition of unions and collective bargaining and working class entitlements came also notions of responsibilities that workers had to abide by. One of the first responsibilities was they had to get rid of the communists and the unions through the Cold War in the 1950s, late 40s and 50s, which they did. And you people will appreciate that, even social democratic parties don't necessarily want anybody on the left kind of raising, irksome questions with them. So you have to, in some senses, the workers' movement has to go back to kind of square one. We have unions, and they are vital, even in their beleaguered state of the current moment. They are vital to the struggle to transform the world. But in order to fulfill that promise that they can be vital agents in transforming the world, you need to establish, militant caucuses in the union that will both educate workers to possibilities and push the ossified leaderships, to the left, and be unafraid of challenging on many, many fronts. But the sad reality is that the struggle has to take place, as it did in Minneapolis, against the political structures of elitism, against employers and capitalist authority and power, and often against their own leaderships in not just in the trade union movement, but in the political sphere. And with the Minneapolis workers, it was against Governor Olson, who was a farmer labor, leader, a left winger, who liked to say, I was a member of the IWW, and I learned how to fight with them. Of course, he totally misunderstood what the IWW was about. But so the reason we perhaps don't have it is the entire culture is organized to, in fact, deflect militant class struggle politics, and to sort of denigrate and to keep on the margins those who would embrace it.
Mhm. And I just see a question in the chat asking, what does militant mean?
Uh, Militant is an old term that denoted you know, I think a worker who was willing to fight capital and keep the fight alive, and who was not prone to sort of throw the towel in or to retreat into cultivating his or her own garden, but to see the struggle of the classes as a necessity and as really the vital sort of tonic of the future.
He thinks militarism.
Oh,
What you're saying.
no, militant is different than militarism. Yeah, militarism, no. And in fact, militants are generally opposed to militarism, and particularly they're not opposed to fighting, in a soldierly way, but they see militarism as really the armed force of the state and as the organized way in which capital orchestrates wars and other sort of predatory endeavors. And militants are, I would say, almost universally and historically opposed to that.
Great. Thank you. So I guess I'll do Hans next because he hasn't had a chance to ask a question yet, and then we'll go to you, David. Thank you.
Bryan, thank you so much for doing this. I just tuned in late, unfortunately, but I have a book here which is called Labor's Giant Step by Art Price, who was an SWPer and a companion of Harold Dobbs and Reid. Have you any comment on this book and its relevance as a companion to your book, which unfortunately I have not read yet? Art Price, Labor's Giant Step. I think it was published in the 50s.
Yeah, yes, I think it's a very good book, and I think if you were interested in understanding the context of 1934, which Tom laid out in an introduction, and the three strikes that happened in 1934, the San Francisco longshoremen, the auto parts workers in Toledo, Ohio, and the Teamsters in Minneapolis. That book provides an excellent snapshot of the three strikes, and it looks at the way in which they paved the way for labor's giant step in terms of the organization of the Congress of Industrial Organizations in the later 1930s. And unlike many labor histories, it really does place an accent on the militant and communist leadership of these mobilizations. And it looks at the ways that while John L. Lewis, rode the wave of that 1934 militancy, he also in the pivotal role he played in creating the CIO, both took that wave forward to some extent, but then in some senses created barriers to its ongoing sort of evolution or development.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll do the last question of David, and then we'll try to wrap up at 8.
All right. Thanks again, Jasmine. Yeah, Bryan. Yeah, thanks for your earlier your first answer to my first question. I am wondering, looking at the recent mass protest in Minneapolis, what I understand was that the Teamsters did not participate in it. I'm just wondering if you have had a chance to study what happened around this recent mass protest in Minneapolis in comparison to what happened in Minneapolis in 1934.
Yeah, I don't know about what role the Teamsters played. I mean the Friday demonstration that was a general strike was, I think, mobilized pretty much by the established mainstream trade union movement in Minneapolis, and that was good. But I'm a bit surprised that the Teamsters played no role, but their leadership there now is very, very different than what the leadership was in 1934.
Not so different from Tobin, though.
Perhaps not so different from Tobin, as Tom comments. So it perhaps is not surprising that they are not in the vanguard at the moment. Um, but I think what was heartening about the Minneapolis events was that, people had been waiting for the trade unions to play a role, and they did play a role ultimately in Minneapolis in organizing that protest. Now, I think they were probably pushed by people in the streets who were already, many of whom were unionists. But I think the push probably came from below. But the trade union movement did get behind it and offered its support and its organizational capacities, which was a very positive, a very positive thing.
Although I think it should be noted that almost all of the unions, if not all of them, claimed that they were tied by the no strike clauses in their contracts and didn't. There were no unions that actually backed it by shutting down the places and walking out, to my knowledge. Certainly,
Yeah.
most of them didn't. So, on the other hand, it was a very impressive display of resistance, and as we know, it pushed Trump back at least temporarily in Minneapolis.
Thank you both. That's both good points. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Brian and Tom, for organizing this and for speaking. Yeah, I'll just remind everyone that this is a reoccurring event that we're doing every Wednesday night. So next week, Eve will be here with his two lawyers to talk about his case um, when he emailed the cops and got charged for that. So that would be a super important one. Um, and yeah, we'll see everybody else at the Monday general meeting then. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.